moving from research to something that feels a lot more like contingency planning. From research to something that feels a lot more like contingency planning, contingency planning.
Welcome to this second day of the third FinTech conference organized by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And if we do get some more Bitcoin miners, we might be able to get that clock to move. But apparently that's an empty part of the chain. But we're going to start with Tim Lane with the Bank of Canada, who's going to present his perspectives on digital currencies.
Thank you very much, Robert, and and also thank you very much to the organizers for putting on this event and for inviting me. It's a very interesting area, very I think exciting area now. It's really about understanding how technology is already changing our world, and from a point of view of central banks, it's about how the advances in technology that we're seeing could affect our mandate and our ability to perform our mandate, which is to provide our citizens with means of payment that they can use with confidence. And that means both sort of the mechanics of how they're provided, the security and safety of those things, but also the stability of their purchasing power, which is something we deliver with monetary policy. And so we're thinking about all those aspects when we think about this sort of digital this issue of digital currency. Now, the Bank of Canada, we've been, for the last 5 or 6 years, been doing research on basically the question of, in this world where various private operators are developing digital currencies or things that aspire to be digital currencies. Is this something central banks should be trying to do? I mean, is there a way that we could actually create a digital equivalent of the humble banknote, something that would perform some of the same functions as that, and but would still be transferable through digital means and through online transactions? And I guess the question arises, well, why would we want to do that? And really, I think the conclusion when we think about it is that we can't really see a compelling reason for doing it under current circumstances, but we can plausibly see the world changing in a way that could actually make it something we'd want to consider very seriously, and in fact be ready to do if those circumstances arose. So, I mean, here we're really thinking about a couple of alternative scenarios, and actually they're not mutually exclusive, but they're kind of distinct in the things that are driving them. And one of them is a scenario where you have private digital currencies of some description that start to get a major footprint in the economy, and they start to be widely used for transactions. And then at that point, the question is, well, are they going to actually provide the functions of money in a way that is consistent with the mandate of central banks that I referred to? And I guess, for example, you can imagine a world where you have multiple providers of digital currencies, and in that case, you'd be in a world a little bit reminiscent of a historical context where private banks were issuing banknotes, and where any merchant had to think, well, okay, this is one from the first Wilmington Bank. I wonder if they're are they trading at par this week, and that sort of thing. And you have this whole problem of of having to get a lot of information about what it is you're accepting in transactions, and of course central banks basically created a public monopoly on banknotes, and that in a sense created a common standard, brought the trust of a public institution behind it, and gave the public basically a coordinating mechanism for around one means of payment, and others that were kind of built on that. And so that's of course one variant of a scenario where private cryptocurrencies could actually create a world where we would see a need to create a public digital currency. But I guess another one is a scenario which is currently being looked at pretty closely in Sweden, because it's actually happening there. And that's actually for much lower tech reasons. It's the fact that the banknotes are actually dwindling in their daily use to the point where you're actually reaching a tipping point, where you've got not only the dwindling use by members of the public, but also you've got merchants increasingly refusing to accept banknotes, and you've got and you've got banks increasingly not offering services to process banknotes. And the thing is, once you get to that point, then you start to worry that people who want to use banknotes are actually not able to do that. And we know that there are a number of reasons that people like banknotes. We've had a lot of research at the Bank of Canada on means of payment and trying to get a sense of why people use banknotes. But I mean, some of it is the safety, some of it's privacy you get from paying with cash, and I'll talk about that a little more because it is a two-edged sword. One of them is the sort of resilience, the fact that if the system goes down or the bank's closed or whatever, you can still use cash to pay for things. It's the fact that anybody can use it. You don't have to have a bank account. If you're new to the country, you can change your foreign money into domestic money. If you're homeless, you can accept donations in cash, and you don't have to have a bank account to process it, and so on. So there are a number of reasons that people like banknotes. And the question is, well, would we miss them if we didn't have them? I mean, if they did sort of go out of circulation, of course there are things we can do to delay the point at which we start to see them disappearing from daily use. But a question would be, if we created a digital form of banknote, would that actually create some benefit to the public? And in fact, could it recreate some of the benefits that we think we're providing when we are responsible for providing cash? So those are questions we've been mulling over, and we have quite a lot of research. In fact, interesting, Rod, Garrett is here, and he's been with us for some time as a visiting scholar, now back in Santa Barbara, but basically contributed quite a lot to our thinking about this. But we've been thinking about a number of different aspects of these questions, and it really, I think, is particularly interesting because it combines quite a lot of different aspects: the technological, the legal, the sort of financial and economic aspects. And more broadly, sort of the governance, the role of the central bank versus the role of the private sector in the financial system. And so, we have research that's been showing up on our website, but we're actually now at a bit of an inflection point where we're moving from research to something that feels a lot more like contingency planning. From research to something that feels a lot more like contingency planning, because we're aware that the world can change very quickly. And although we don't think that Bitcoin is the money of the future, we think that it's got too many flaws in its design to be that. But at the same time, the world could change in a way that would very rapidly transform the way that people pay for things. And if we start to think about what we might do in reaction to that, when that starts to become evident, then that's going to be too late. We're just going to have to accept the way the world evolves. And so we really need to be working deliberately ahead to be ready to respond if the occasion arises. So that's kind of where we are with our work. Of course, there are some very complicated aspects of this. I'd like to touch maybe on a couple of them very briefly, and one of them is what a central bank digital currency would do to the banking system. Obviously, what we envisage is something that is envisages something that would not be directly competing with bank deposits. It would be something that would be more in the nature of performing the functions of cash in a context where cash is becoming less widely used. But of course, one can't guarantee that the outcome would be exactly what we would plan, and so we're sort of thinking about how a product could be designed so that it doesn't sort of, in a sense, disintermediate the banking system to an excessive degree. And in particular, I think there's the whole question of, if there were a loss of confidence in the banking system, loss of confidence in the banking system, loss of confidence in the banking system, then would the availability of a digital currency make it a lot easier for a digital retail bank run to take place? I mean, our preliminary response to that is, well, actually, you should work more on the fundamentals of the banking system to make sure that confidence is maintained. And then, in fact, for the public, there is one of the solid underpinnings of confidence in the banking system is precisely the knowledge that I have money in the bank, and if I want to, I can get crisp banknotes in exchange for that, and those have the well, in this country, the Federal Reserve, in Canada, the Bank of Canada, standing behind them. And so that degree of confidence in the banking system, in our view, is quite an important rationale for thinking about this at all. I guess another aspect maybe to touch on briefly is the whole privacy issue. And I mentioned that privacy is certainly a legitimate reason for people to prefer to use cash for certain things. I mean, if I give money to a panhandler on the street, I don't want to give away all my banking information necessarily. There are a number of contexts in which actually privacy is good. And this is particularly true, I think, now that we've had some high-profile data breaches where financial institutions have been careless with information. And so for many members of the public, maybe they do prefer to at least to carry out some of their transactions in cash where there's no record to get lost. And so that's legitimate. Of course, there's also the whole dark side of privacy, which is money laundering, terrorist financing, tax evasion, and all that. And so it's actually, I mean, in our view, it's kind of unthinkable that a central bank would be allowed to design a product that would become the ideal and perfectly scalable means for doing all those things. So clearly, if we ever did issue a digital currency, it would have to have some safeguards, the way we have with people who go into the bank and ask for $100,000 in hundreds. It's sort of I mean, there has to be some degree of ability for law enforcement to investigate some of these things with a proper warrant and some in some way that very large transactions get flagged. But of course, that involves issues of the governance, and it also involves making sure the technology is capable of doing that, and sort of how you marry a degree of privacy which actually makes this acceptable to the public versus a degree of sort of safeguards against illicit use, I think is something we'll have to be working on more deliberately and in a more concrete way. So anyway, as I said at the outset, a really exciting area, and we've got a lot of work to do. We've got a team working on this at the Bank of Canada, and certainly quite a number of other central banks are also working on the same topic. And I mean, I think I mentioned Sweden. I think the Riksbank has had quite a large public discussion of this. But this work on central bank digital currency goes alongside of just trying to get a better understanding of how the world is evolving and the various private products that are being issued, and many of which I think will actually make important and useful innovations in the way that we do our business, and that's very exciting. So with that, I'll leave it to the other panelists.